Now, this idea of a difficulty in maintaining a union of different ethnic or regional identities, sectional differences, class differences, is really a running theme for this entire section. We're going to see how this plays out in both the United States and also within Latin America. Now, the main issues we need to discuss in the United States is really the fusion of manifest destiny and the idea of sectional differences within the United States. And sectional differences, we are predominantly looking at industrial north, agricultural south, and then, of course, the burgeoning western frontier. Now, manifest destiny is what's perceived as a God-given right or responsibility for the American citizens to expand and cultivate the entire continent, to really spread their influence all the way from the East Coast to the Pacific Ocean. And manifest destiny actually resounds very much within the American South because, in order for them to keep up with the demands for their raw products, cotton, tobacco, indigo, rice, etc., those are plants, products that tend to leach the soil. And so they're continuously having to expand and find fresh soil in order to keep up with this demand by the northern industry and by the textile industry in Great Britain. Now, the ability to own land really isn't that common in the old world, where there's very little land that's available to settle and farm. Generally, farmland tends to be owned by either large landowners or tends to be passed from father to eldest son to his eldest son to his eldest son. And any other individual, any other son, younger son, they're just going to have to find something else to do. Land is very, very expensive. Whereas in the United States, that's really a primary reason why we have such large migrations. The fact that those traditional opportunities in Europe are very much being closed off. And yet, the idea of continuing your farming tradition in America, very much a possibility. There's definitely a marked gap that we see in the ideals of the revolution. So, we're going to be looking at a few specific groups, starting with the indigenous groups, the Indians. Despite some initial usefulness, we all know the story about the Pilgrims and the Indians and the first Thanksgiving. So, despite some usefulness in the early colonial era for supplying food or trading goods or farming techniques, Indians by the Americans are frequently seen as in the way, particularly within the American South. So where again they wanted to expand, but they're constantly finding themselves having expanding into Indian territory. And we're not talking about small tribes, we're talking about very large confederations, namely the Creek, the Cherokee, and in Florida, as there's an increasing motivation to move south, the Seminole Indians. Now, the Indian Removal Act, which was signed by President Jackson, the idea wasn't necessarily saying that, okay, we decide that Indians are unfit for this land, ergo, you have to get out. The wording of the document was very much saying that we are now open for negotiations by the state, by the federal government. And in these negotiations, the Indians would therefore sign away their rights to territory in Georgia, Alabama, Florida, Mississippi, etc., and they would sign new territory rights to other locations, namely Indian country, which was going to be Oklahoma. So technically, it's supposed to be an even distribution of land, but there's very little likelihood that this is going to be an even exchange. And of course, the Indians themselves are fighting removal as much as humanly possible. They do not want to leave this territory because they see it as theirs. So, in the midst of all these treaties, the Indians themselves, particularly the Cherokee and the Creek, the Seminole, are able to escape further down to South Florida. They are not actually prepared for removal. They simply wake up one morning and there are thousands of U.S. cavalry troops ready to move them by force. And so they have very little in the way of time for preparation in terms of supplies. So, on what's known as the Trail of Tears, which is going to be the forced march from the southern United States into Oklahoma, many thousands of Indians are going to die because of poor nutrition, frostbite, anything that you can definitely imagine being forced to go on this journey. And no support is given to them by the U.S. Army. So there's nothing in terms of supplies of food, blankets, etc. The Indians are basically on their own. Now, there's going to be a renewal of forcing Indians out or trying to actually eliminate tribes altogether in the West in the later 19th century. But the later 19th century is also going to see an acknowledgement that, okay, look, the Indians can't help what they are. They are Indians. And really, as the more educated, more civilized group of humanity, we really need to extend those benefits to them. And so you're going to see institutions like the Carlisle School, and these are boarding schools specifically for Indian children. That if Indian children are taken away from their families, away from their tribal influences, and they're given Western education, Western religion, and basically all of the ideals of Western society and that are forced upon them, then you're actually going to develop a what white society would consider a more civilized, a better group of individuals. Now, these individuals are not going to be seen as equal because, again, they're not white. And so they're always going to be seen as a little bit different. There is some enthusiasm for children or for young people who end up going through these schools. But these are very much military schools. If you take a look at the picture in your textbook of children, notice how many of the girls have their hair cropped very, very short, very much like myself. Their hair was cut when they came in, although the fashion for Western women was to have very long hair and to braid it and pin it up. But Indian girls' hair is cut because they want to try and sever that native identity or that native culture that's tied to a woman's hair. And so you're very much trying to strip everything possible.